Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another day of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. And I say this every time, but I'm so excited to join you or that you're joining us because today we're going to talk about what is my favorite habitat. Now, I probably say that a lot, favorite animal, favorite this, but we're going to talk about what is my top favorite habitat in the ocean, and that is the tide pool. Now, behind me is a tide pool here at the aquarium, and we'll get into talking about what a tide pool is, maybe where you can find some tide pools and what it's like to go exploring in this habitat. And then we'll explore some of the animals who call this habitat home. But before we get started, I do want to share that we would love to hear from you today. And whether that's to say hi and good morning, to share your observations, or even ask some questions. Now, I'm in the studio with Sergio, and he just put up this number right here. So you can go ahead and text us those questions, those observations, those good mornings to 562 286 1838. And that's if you're watching live on October 1st. Happy October, everyone. We want you to text if you're able to. You can also use our email, and you can use that email live or after the fact. And you can email us at live@lbaop.org. So those are two ways that you're able to reach out to us and ask your questions, and we can really get to know what you want to know and talk about those things and explore all the cool things that this habitat has to offer. All right, now that we kind of laid that groundwork, let's get talking about tide pools. So I've mentioned this tide pool habitat. And first we're going to start with that word habitat. What does that word habitat mean? Now we do talk about that word a lot, and there are habitats in the ocean and on land. So we even live in habitats as humans. But a habitat is where an animal lives. It's their home. And there's lots of things that can make up the habitat. So I'm going to step off, and you can see that in this video, this is a video taken of one of our exhibits here. This recreates a habitat, and there are some things that are living, and there are non-living things in the habitat as well. And that's true for all habitats. They have living and non-living things, and they build up that space for an animal to live. Now, today we are talking specifically about a tide pool habitat. Now, I'm going to go over to my document camera, and I'm going to write out that word for us. I'm going to write habitat up in the corner, just so we have that word written out, habitat. But we're going to focus on a tide pool. And I like to write it down because I think a good way to help us understand this habitat is to break it up into two parts. We've got tide and we've got pool. Now, starting with a pool, think about what you need for a pool. Now, think about maybe you've been to a swimming pool, maybe you have a swimming pool at home or in your community, or you visited a friend or family who has a swimming pool. What do you need for a pool? There's two things. What do you think? That's right. Water is one of them. Absolutely. In all those pools, wherever you go, there's water, right? That's what you go into. You go into the water. What is the second thing you need for that pool? Now, sometimes I hear answers like chlorine or those chemicals to make the water nice and safe for us to be in. And that's true for a swimming pool. But in a tide pool, there's no chlorine in that water. But what else do we need to make that pool? Think about the space. We need like a container. We need a space to hold the water. If you have just a flat space in front of you and you pour a bucket of water on the ground, is the water going to stay all together? No, it's going to spread out and kind of seep and keep going until there's no more water or it hits a barrier. So we need a container or a space to hold that water in place. Now, for a swimming pool, like in your backyard or in your community, usually it's concrete. Maybe you have an inflatable pool, so it's that sort of plastic material that holds it all together. But for a tide pool out in a natural habitat, it's going to be rocks. Let's take a look at a picture of a tide pool out at the ocean. Excellent. So these are tide pools right here. Now, sometimes they can be really big and sometimes they're small. But what you see is you've got water, and then these rocks here, they create spaces to hold or contain the water. So that is the second part of that word, tide pool. So a pool, we need water and a space to hold it. And for this habitat, it's the rocks that are going to hold that water. Now, the first part of this word, tide, this one might be a little more tricky. Now, if you hear that word tide, let's bring up, there we go. This word tide, the first thing you might think of is maybe laundry. Maybe your family uses Tide detergent. That's what I use when I do my laundry. But the tide that we're referring to here is a little bit different. This has to do with the movement of water in the ocean. Now, the tide is tied to the moon, the gravitational pull from the moon, and it changes the water level of the ocean. Now, there are 2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day. So that means that the water level is going to rise and the water level is going to lower twice a day. And that's the changing of the tide. Now, I'm going to draw, we'll watch a video in just a moment, but I'm going to draw a really quick tide pool. So these are the rocks right here. And there are some spaces here where the water can get caught. Let's draw some water. For a blue marker, here we go. So high tide would mean the water is all the way up here. And we know it's high tide because all of these rocks here, they're covered by water. The water is all the way up here. So this is high tide, and then we'll put a person here for reference. So this person is very happy to be here at the beach at high tide. But they can't see any of these rocks below because the water level is really high. But as I said, it changes throughout the day. So when it's low tide, what happens is this water line, it's what it calls recedes, which basically means that it just kind of goes down or it goes back out. It lowers. So instead of that water line being all the way up here, that water line could be all the way down here at the bottom. And what happens is as that water moves back out, all those spaces in the rocks, water gets caught. And that creates tide pools. So the tide pools are visible during low tide. They're still there during high tide, but they're often completely covered by water. So when you go to the tide pools, if you go, you want to go at low tide because that's when all of these little pools will be exposed, and it's easy to see because animals live in these little spaces. Now, the animals will live there during high tide too. They're going to live in these spaces. And then when the water goes out, those pools are full of water, which makes them able to stay in those homes during that low tide. And so that is the tide pool. Let's take a look at a video of some tide pools. Help us kind of get a good picture of what that looks like. Excellent. So this is a time lapse. So those changing tides, it does take a long time. If you think about a day is 24 hours, and throughout the day there's 2 high tides and 2 low tides. So it's a couple hours for the tide to come in, a couple hours for the tide to go out, a couple more hours for the tide to come in, and to go back out. But we had someone who sat there all day taking pictures or filming video and then sped it up. So you can see this tide coming in. And look, it's going to cover all of these rocks. There's some people looking really fast. So see how much is exposed right here? We'll watch it one more time. So all this is exposed. There's probably lots of little animals living in these little pools here. But as the tide comes in, all of this is going to get covered. And the water is going to be pretty much to right here. Excellent. Pretty cool, huh? So if you go to the tide pool, so if you live here in Southern California, we have lots of tide pools all along our coast. Down in Huntington and Newport, in San Pedro, there's some really great tide pools, in Palos Verdes, but all the way up our coastline, all the way into Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, we have lots of really great tide pools to go see. But what you want to do when you're going to the tide pools is you want to look up a tide chart. Now, I have an app on my phone. If you have a phone or you have access to one, maybe with your parent or an adult, they can download that app, or you can just go online and look for a tide chart, and that's going to tell you what the tide is and the time of the low tide. Now, anything that's a negative number is a great tide, and coming into winter, we get some really great low tides at some good hours. So usually in the mid-afternoon, 2 and 3, we'll get some really low tides. They're often called king tides, which are the lowest tides of the year, where they're like a negative 1.7 or 8, and that is an excellent time to go explore the tide pools. But really, any tide that's like 0.01 or even a negative is a great time to go to the tide pool. You just want to make sure that you're going with a buddy, so you have someone there with you. It's always more fun to explore with a buddy, but it's also good for safety reasons. You want to make sure you've got good shoes on. If you have water shoes, that's great, or just some good shoes that are grippy because the rocks can be kind of slippery. And you want to make sure you're going during that low tide, and when it starts to be high tide, you move on back to the shore just so you don't get caught. But exploring the tide pools is really cool because it's so easy. It's right along our coast. What I think is great is you don't need a lot of gear. So a lot of times people like to go snorkeling or scuba diving, but you need a lot of gear to do those things. And tide pools, a lot of beaches have free access. You can just walk right out onto the rocks and explore these habitats and see some really cool animals just by going and exploring your local coastline. Now that we've sort of established what a tide pool is and what it's like to go explore a tide pool, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the animals who live there. Now, I'm going to let Sergio pick some animals for us to explore. There are tons of animals who live in tide pools. But let's see what we're going to explore first. Excellent. So we actually have two things here in this picture, but we'll focus on one animal, but they are tied together. Do you notice this thing right here? This animal? Have you seen this before? Maybe you have. Maybe you've even touched one. If you've been to the tide pools before, or if you visit us here at our aquarium, another aquarium, there's a good chance you've seen or even touched these animals. So let's take a moment and let's make some observations. Now, you can think these observations in your brain. If you are in class, you can, with your teacher's permission, raise your hand and share your observation. You can turn to the person next to you, again with your teacher's permission, and share your observations. You can also text us at 562-286-1838. What do you notice about this animal? One of the things I notice, maybe you notice this too, is the color. What color do you see on this animal? Exactly, it's purple. Now, I don't think we see many purple animals in nature very often. Maybe some flowers or plants, but this is a purple animal living in the tide pools. Now, the other thing I noticed, and maybe you did too, is it's spiky, right? It looks like it's got spines covering its body. Now, I did say you could touch these animals, but maybe some of you are thinking, why in the world would we want to touch something that looks so spiky and spiny like that? But that's a really interesting thing about this animal. So, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with this animal is called a sea urchin. We can go ahead and all say that together on the count of three. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Sea urchin. Now, really quickly, I'm going to go write down the name so you can see what it looks like. So we'll go over to my document camera really quick. So it's a sea, like the ocean, urchin. Sea urchin. I'll draw really quick. I don't think I have a purple marker, so we'll do it in a darker blue. A little sea urchin. All right, let's go back to our picture. All right, so we notice the spikes or the spines on its body. Now, I did say it's safe to touch this animal because these spines are just to keep that animal safe. So some animals might have spines and they might try and prick you with those spines. Maybe there's toxins in their spines, or their spines might come off their body when they try and prick you with it. Sea urchins, their spines are only so that they can look scarier. So definitely looking at this, I would think I wouldn't want to touch that, or I definitely wouldn't want to take a bite of it because then you would just get a mouthful of spines. But really the urchin is just like, I've got spines, so you think that I'm scary, but really all I do all day is sit there being all spiny. You can make yourself into a sea urchin. You just sit there being spiny. So they stay safe by looking scarier than they actually are. So here at the aquarium, we have these purple sea urchins, and you can touch them really gently. It kind of feels like you're touching the end of a toothpick or maybe the point of a sharpened pencil. But as long as you're gentle with them, they're safe to touch. Now that's true of the sea urchins here in Southern California, the purple urchins. We also have red urchins, which are a lot bigger. Their spines are longer. But there are other urchins in tropical water, so warmer water, that can have toxins or poison in them. So just be careful when you're touching, making sure you know what animal it is that you're touching. Here in Southern California, our purple sea urchins and our red sea urchins, safe to touch. So the purple urchins, they just use those spines to look scarier. There's no toxins or anything in them. But something else they do with those spines is they are considered burrowing animals. Now this maybe is new because a lot of people don't really know that about sea urchins. And burrowing means basically you dig into the ground. Now they're not digging into the ground, but they actually will dig into rocks. So take a look here. You can kind of see it starting to happen here. But sea urchins will actually grind their way into the rocks and they'll sit in the rock. So imagine a space that's carved out and that sea urchin sits right inside. And that makes it even harder for an animal to get that sea urchin because not only is it spiky, but it's sitting in that space. So if you go to a tide pool locally here, you'll often see these sort of carved out circles with a sea urchin sitting in it. So it almost looks like they're flat because it's just in that space. And they actually use those spines to grind their way into rock, which is fascinating to me because those spines, they can break off. They aren't indestructible. They can break and splinter, but they do use them to grind their way into a rock. And that is just a second way that they're able to stay safe because it's harder to pull them out when they're sitting deep inside a rock. Here you can even see them moving. So that what you see moving here, you've got their spines moving. You can kind of see it up here too. But if you look really closely, there almost looks like little strings. I think they kind of look almost like little noodles that are kind of hovering around that sea urchin. So sea urchins have something called tube feet. Now it's not the number 2, it's tube, T-U-B-E, tube feet, which are sticky feet that help them move around. And it also helps them to grab a hold of things because those tube feet have suction cups at the end to stick onto things. So that's how a sea urchin can hold onto the rocks, is they have these sticky feet they can stick onto. Oh, excellent. Thank you, Sergio. Take a look at this picture. So we can see the spines, but you can see all these tube feet. And they're all around. So they're the top, and you can see them down here on the bottom. So this is how they hold onto the rocks, and they can hold on really, really tight. Now, there are lots of animals who suck their tube, which we might talk about some other ones. And sometimes they can hold on really strong, and sometimes those tube feet aren't as strong. But sea urchins, they can hold on really, really tight. It's hard to pry them off a rock, which helps them because it makes it harder, one, for other animals to pull them off a rock, maybe to eat them. It also makes it harder when they live in the tide pools and these waves are crashing over them a lot. They don't move around too much because they're stuck nice and on that rock. But it's also helpful to have these tube feet up here because that's how they can catch their food or hold on to their food. And that picture we looked at, the very first one where they were sitting on a piece of kelp, this one, this is what they like to eat. Now, their mouth is on the bottom, which is why this sea urchin is sitting on top of this piece of kelp. But those tube feet can help them grab a hold of a piece of kelp and bring it into their mouth. Now, another thing they like to do with those tube feet is they will grab a hold of little rocks and they'll cover themselves. So they'll take little bits of rocks and shells and they'll cover their body. Now, why do you think an animal who lives amongst rocks would take other rocks and put them all over their body? Let's think about that for a moment. Maybe we can go to a picture that has a lot of different animals in the tide pool, including our sea urchins. And let's ponder this question. Why might a sea urchin? Excellent. Do you spot the sea urchin in here? There's a couple of them, and some of them are even doing what we just talked about. So there is one sea urchin all the way over here. But if you look down here, we've got some sea urchins. And look, this one has a rock here and here. This one right here, and then there's another one hiding just below it, has this big rock on top of it. And then this one over here has a couple rocks on it. Now, sometimes when guests see this, they get concerned. They think that sea urchin is going to get squished by the rock. But in reality, that sea urchin used their suction cup feet and moved those rocks on top of them. So why do you think a sea urchin might want to cover themselves in rocks? Now, our local ocean here in Southern California isn't the most colorful place. Now, I know this picture kind of doesn't make that seem true because in the tide pool, there can be a lot of colors, lots of oranges and purples and pink colors, some yellows and greens. But for most of Southern California in our kelp forest, it's not the brightest habitat. It's not like a tropical habitat with coral reefs where we get lots and lots of color. So for animals who are a bright color, like look at this, right? We've got some reds, but pretty much you got browns and greens. That's pretty much the color scheme for our local habitats. So for an animal like a sea urchin that's really bright purple, it's going to stand out. And I know we said that most animals probably wouldn't want to eat a sea urchin, but there are some animals who live in the tide pool or near the tide pool who do like to eat sea urchins. Things like sunflower stars or sea otters. Now, not here in Southern California, we don't have sea otters, but in Northern California. And people like to eat sea urchins too. So by covering themselves in rocks like we see over there and helping them blend in to the tide pool, it kind of helps them to camouflage and hide their color and hide their body. And that way it makes it harder for other animals to find them. So while it looks kind of funny and kind of cool for us, it actually helps as protection for this animal. All right, let's see another animal that lives in the tide pool that we can talk about besides our sea urchin. Excellent. Do you recognize these animals? This is a pretty popular one. That's right, they are sea stars. Now I'm going to go over to my board and write it down. Now, sometimes people call them starfish. Maybe you said starfish. I'm going to write sea star. But if you called it a starfish, that's totally okay. Because that tells me you do know what you're talking about. You know what animal. And people do call them starfish sometimes, but as scientists, we do like to call them sea stars because we know that to be a fish, there's some things you need on your body: gills, fins, and scales, those three main things. And sea stars, they don't have those things. So we know that they're not true fish, so we call them sea stars. But if you call it a starfish, that is totally fine by me because that tells me you know what this animal is. All right, let's go back to the picture. And let's make some observations. We'll have Sergio put that text line back up. And let's make some observations about this animal. What do you notice? Are there anything about this animal that's maybe similar to the sea urchin? Or is it all completely different things? Because I'll tell you, although it's kind of hard to see it in this picture, there are some things that sea stars and sea urchins do have in common because these animals are actually related. They're kind of like cousins. So there's a group of animals, many who live in the tide pool, called echinoderms. Now that's a big word, but what it really means is spiny skinned animals. So any animal that's in the group of echinoderms, they have spiny skin, and they also have something called radial symmetry, which that's a big word, but what it really means is they've got 5 points to their body. Can you find 5 points on these animals here? I bet this one's kind of easy. Yeah, our sea stars have 5 arms. Like, let's take a look at this sea star right here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arms. So that's a characteristic of sea stars, but all echinoderms have some like 5 points on their body. For sea urchins, it's their mouth, their teeth. They have 5 teeth. For sea stars, it's 5 arms. What else do you notice about the sea stars? The colors, absolutely. Sea stars come in all kinds of colors. Urchins too. We looked at purple urchins and I mentioned red urchins, but there's also green and white and pink and black urchins. And sea stars, we can see them here. They come in orange and white and pink and yellows and multicolor, right? Some of these have multiple colors. We even have blue sea stars here at the aquarium, which is really cool because I had never seen a blue. This one's called a bat star, these ones here. I had never seen blue bat stars until I worked here at the aquarium, which they're really cool. They're beautiful sea stars. Excellent. So they've come in all different colors. What else do we notice? Maybe we can take a look at a different angle view of a sea star really quick. All right, excellent. Let's make some observations here. So now we're looking at still the same kind of sea star, a bat star, but we're looking at sort of the top and the bottom. Excellent. Now, while you're making observations here, someone mentioned that these sea stars have a hydrostatic skeleton, which sounds like a really complex term, and it kind of is because it refers to something that's very different than what humans have. So what that hydrostatic skeleton means is that they have water moving through their body, and it fills all the spaces and allows them to move the way that they do. So sea stars and many other invertebrates, animals with no bones, a lot of them don't have blood, right? We have our blood that pumps through our body. But these animals, they have water that moves through their body, sort of in the same way that the blood moves through our body, pumps through their body, helps them move. Doesn't keep them alive the same way that blood keeps us alive, but rather than having the blood as a circulatory system, they have this water vascular system, or this hydrostatic skeleton that moves through their body, which is pretty neat to think about. Now, what do you notice here? We've called them tube feet, right? We named them earlier with our sea urchin. So another characteristic of those echinoderms, that group of spiny skinned animals, are having tube feet. So these feet are suction cups at the end, and they fill with water, right? That water moving through their body. Those tubes will fill with water and they'll create a seal, which you can kind of see happening right here. And then they're going to release the water from that tube, which releases its hold, and then they can fill the next tube foot with water to create that seal. So sea stars use it for movement, and similar to the sea urchin, they also use it to hold on to their food or to grab their food and then to open and start to eat their food. So here's the bottom view of a sea star, and you can see all those little polka dots. Those are their tube feet. Excellent. Pretty cool, right? Now, depending on the sea star and the size of them, they might have more or less of these tube feet, but they do have tube feet on every arm in these cavities right here. Now, I did say that sea stars have 5 arms, but there are some sea stars that might have more. Now, occasionally we'll see the sea stars that should have 5 might have 6 or 7 or 8 arms, and that's just like a genetic anomaly. But there's also a star called a sun star that has 7 or 8 arms, as it should, and then there's a sunflower star, which can have up to 25 arms, which are pretty cool. Excellent. Here's a picture of the underside of a sunflower star. Now, take a look at those tube feet. When I say they got varying amounts, they definitely have varying amounts. There are tons of tube feet here. Now, sunflower stars are a really interesting animal. We do have them locally, but they tend to live deeper in the tide pool. So there's different zones in a tide pool, kind of like in that drawing, closer up to the surface and then lower down. And there's different animals that we can find at those different zones in the tide pool. And sunflower stars tend to live deeper in the tide pools and then into the kelp forest. But they play a really important role for us here along the California coast in our tide pool and our kelp forest, because these animals are one of the few animals who eat sea urchins. So that spiky animal, that first animal we talked about, sunflower stars will feed on them. And that actually is really important because, as I mentioned, those sea urchins, they eat kelp. And if we have too many sea urchins, they'll eat the whole kelp forest. And that removes a habitat from the ocean. But having an animal like a sunflower star who will eat the urchins helps keep the urchin population balanced. So we have some urchins, but we don't have too many, and we don't have too few. We have the perfect amount if we have a good amount of sunflower stars. Now, the problem we're facing right now is that sunflower stars were affected by a disease, and it killed off a lot of our sunflower stars. And so, with less sunflower stars, that means we had more sea urchins, which means they ate more kelp, which hurt our kelp forest. So here at the aquarium, we are actually part of a conservation project where we're working to breed and raise sunflower stars. And eventually, we're not there yet because we're still working on the science, but eventually we're going to go replant them. So take these baby sunflower stars and put them back in the ocean in the hopes of expanding the population to help balance out that sea urchin population, which is going to help protect our kelp forest, which is a really cool project to be a part of. Now, that was a really quick run through of that conservation project, but it's really interesting and we're doing a lot of great work. And if you have more questions about that project, you can look on our website or use that text line or email address and let us know you have more questions and we'll be able to share more information about it. All right, we've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to let Sergio pick one more tide pool animal for us to explore. Ah, excellent. Another one that you may or may not recognize. If you've been to the aquarium or to a tide pool, you probably do recognize this animal. That's right. This one is a sea anemone. All right, let's write this one down. Excellent. So, I spelled that wrong. Someone asked if what I was talking about referencing for the sunflower stars is sea star wasting disease, and that is correct. So, sea star wasting disease is a disease, it's a viral disease that is in the water. We aren't 100% sure how it happened or what caused this virus to kind of enter our water, but it's been affecting our sea star population since about 2013 here in Southern California. It's affected a couple different types of sea stars. So not all sea stars were affected by sea star wasting. These bat stars, this one right here, the ones that we looked at, they seem to be fine. But these ones right here, which are called giant spined or knobby stars, and these ochre stars here, these ones, were really heavily hit, and sunflower stars as well, by this wasting disease. And it basically caused their bodies to waste away. And so it wiped out this population of sea stars. Now we're slowly seeing them come back. So the disease is there, the virus is not as strong in our water as it used to be, but it's still affecting some kinds of sea stars, specifically our sunflower stars. Excellent. All right, so really quickly, because we've got maybe a minute left, anemone, a sea anemone. Let's go back to that picture. This is another animal that you commonly find in the tide pool. Now this picture here is of a fish-eating anemone. Can you guess what it eats? You got it. It eats fish. This is a larger anemone that's going to be found in a lower tidal zone, so maybe not at the very top where we go looking. It's also a colder water species. So this one lives more in Northern California than here in Southern California. But if you go to the tide pools, you will often see anemones. We've got some bigger anemones here. And then there's often some little ones that you can find closer up to the surface. Now, if you go to the tide pools, sometimes you might see anemones with all those tentacles tucked into them. And similar to the sea urchin who cover themselves with rocks, they'll have little shells and things stuck to the outside of them, helping them to blend in. Now, those tentacles are important, though, because they do have stinging cells in them, and they allow them to help them catch their food. All right, we've gone over time. This is a great picture of a green anemone. Just like those sea stars and the urchins, they can come in lots of different colors. Now, as you can tell, I can keep talking about tide pool animals because, as I mentioned, it is my favorite habitat. I have many memories of my family going out to the tide pools here in Southern California, in San Pedro and Palos Verdes, and exploring these animals. And they were really fun times, and I look back fondly on those memories, which is why I love talking about this habitat. And I hope now that you've learned a little bit more, that piques your interest, and you want to learn more or continue to learn more, or even go visit these habitats. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed and had some fun time exploring. If you're looking for more programming, we have another program coming up at 10 that Sergio will be teaching, and that will be in Spanish. So we hope to see you then. Bye, everyone.